So welcome everybody to this event which we are co-hosting with CBRE tonight, all about commercial and industrial leasing, an ever-changing and challenging landscape, as the topic says. So tonight what we will hear about is some information from a number of people from CBRE about the state of the commercial and industrial leasing landscape in New South Wales and Australia. And then after that, we will hear from a couple of Bartier Perry people about useful, common, helpful terms and conditions of leasing agreements in this context, and what can happen if things go bad and what you can do about it. So before we get to all of that, there is a bit of housekeeping as always we need to get through. Who am I? I'm Gavin Stewart. I head up the commercial disputes team here at Bartier Perry, and I'm very proud on behalf of Bartier Perry to be hosting this event tonight. We enjoy putting on events like this with our clients and trusted partners, and CBRE is one of those, and we find it a really good way to give us exposure and also to promote our partners as part of the event. And you'll also see, I think some of you picked them up on the way in, some packs that we've put together which contain some information that you might find useful. The slides from tonight are in there. Also a bit of literature about the commercial disputes team and the property team here at Bartier Perry. Some articles that have been issued in and around leasing, and also a couple of products which I'll just plug, one of which is very new, which is a document or a product called the Property and Development Life Cycle, which our property team has recently put together, which explains all of the services they provide in and around property from cradle to grave, and also building construction disputes booklet. So if you didn't pick one of those packs up on the way in, they're on the desk outside if you want to pick one up. So we should get going. So I don't want to interrupt the flow of this evening, so I thought I would just introduce everyone now and then let the presenters take over. So first up we'll hear from Bradley Spears, Tristan Gannon and Michael O'Neill from CBRE, and their expertise is as follows. So Bradley heads up the research at CBRE, 18 leading researchers in that team, and he's been doing that for over 20 years in the sector, and works with major property owners, agencies and analytics houses. Tristan Gannon is the Senior Director in the Advisory and Transaction Services team, and Tristan is a tenant representative in the Sydney market and has advised local and global organisations in their real estate matters across Australia. The team transacted 306 new leases, renewals and disposals across 433,000 square metres of office space in 2018. And Michael O'Neill is the Senior Director in the same team, the Advisory and Transaction Services team, and he leads the industrial sales and leasing practice in Sydney and regional New South Wales, specialising in larger site leasing campaigns and with a strong track record in regional locations. His team is the leading industrial and logistics property team in New South Wales. So after we hear from our CBRE presenters, we'll then hear from Melissa Potter, who is partner and head of our property and planning team here at Bartier Perry. Melissa has over 20 years experience acting for landlords and tenants in drafting, reviewing and negotiating industrial, commercial and retail leases. And then also, well at the same time, Adam Kutry, who is a senior associate in the team that I lead, the commercial disputes team, and he has experience across or working across boutique national and mid-tier firms, and has experience in acting for and against lessees with respect to lease disputes arising in residential, commercial and industrial areas. So, without any further ado, I will hand over to our CBRE presenters to kick us off tonight.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you to Melissa and Adam for inviting us to be here with you this evening. Firstly, by way of introduction, for those of you who aren't aware, Seabury is the world's largest real estate services firm. We have over 90,000 employees spread across 400 offices around the world. In 2019, we were ranked 146 on the Fortune 500, and our stock is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. As Gavin mentioned, in terms of presenters today, we've got Bradley Spears, who heads up our research team across Australia and New Zealand, I, who lead our office tenant representation team, and Mike O'Neill, who leads our industrial brokerage team. In terms of what we'll be covering, Bradley Spears will start off giving us a house view on the economic and macroeconomic environment which we're in, and then touch into the residential, office and industrial markets. Mike and I will also then give what we're seeing on the ground in both the office and industrial markets. But before we get into the data, we wanted to share with you a brief video around some of the predictions that CBRE have that may come into fruition over the next decade. So I'm not 100% sold on the cryptocurrency piece, but I'm happy to be proved wrong on that. So you're probably wondering why a real estate services firm is playing a video about what may occur over the next decade. And the reason is that when organisations are entering into contracts for real estate, whether it's a lease or a contract of sale or some management agreement, they're typically long-term contracts. So they're usually 5 to 10 years or more. And so what this video is intended to spark some thought around is the rate at which the environment at which we're operating in changes, and at the rate of change is growing at an exponential rate. So if we fast forward, rewind back to the year 2000 and look at what are the most valuable companies. It was dominated by pharmaceutical, financial services, oil and gas and manufacturing. If we then jump to 2018, not only have the values increased dramatically, it's completely dominated by tech firms. Similarly, if we look through to the average tenure within the S&P 500. In 1965, S&P firms generally stayed in the S&P 500 for 33 years. By 1990, that had reduced down to 20 years, and by the year 2026, we're anticipating the average tenure will be 14 years. So that's due to factors by organisations not adapting as quickly as some of their competitors and new entrants into the markets and becoming redundant. So by that logic, we anticipate that 50% of the S&P 500 will be replaced within the next decade. So with that sort of setting the scene and hopefully positioning your thinking process, I'll introduce the Brains Trust, or Brad, to give Seabury's house view on the economy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. So what I'll do is, I always, when we're talking about property markets, like to set the scene with how we're seeing things in the broader economy. And you can't get much more macro than the global economy. Over the past 8 months, or at least since the end of last year, we've seen the conditions within the global economy really deteriorate. And as a result, growth expectations for 2019 by the World Bank have been revised down from 3.6 to 2.6, which is quite remarkable. Now, the underlying reason for that is indeed the trade war between the US and China, which is really getting more aggressive as each day passes, and it's showing no signs of abating anytime soon. And how that slowdown is manifesting is it's a lack of confidence, a lack of business confidence, confidence to invest, and also in the manufacturing sector. The JP Morgan global PMI has actually moved into recessionary conditions, and that hasn't occurred since 2012. And manufacturing is essentially, it's the backbone of output. So when that is not firing, the whole global economy slows. It's a bit of a similar story in Australia. We've revised down growth forecasts from 2.8% from the end of last year down to 1.7%, and it might actually even be lower in 2019. We've already seen 2 interest rate cuts, and there's every possibility that we'll see 2 further rate cuts over the next 6 months. So again, similar to the global condition, it really is a slowdown. And for New South Wales, it's coming off some pretty good years. We've had very low levels of unemployment, and investment in residential, commercial sectors has been quite positive. So the wind is definitely moderating, and 2019 is going to be a lower growth year. One thing Australian politicians especially, and also the media, they love to crow about this endless economic expansion in Australia. Well, it's not really true if you look at it on a per capita basis. Since 1991, we've actually had 3 recessions. The first one was around the dot-com crash, the second one was the GFC, and the third one, we're actually right in the middle of it. For the past 3 quarters, on a per capita basis, we've actually seen GDP, real GDP contract. One of the reasons, and the main reason, is the residential sector, the slowdown in residential construction. But on top of that, we've also got the retail sector, which has been languishing for quite a period of time. Over the past 10 years, there hasn't been many periods where, again, if you're looking at on a real spending basis, on a per capita basis, we've been well below that long-term average of about 2%. So given that consumption accounts for about 60% of the economy, when consumption is down, the whole economy isn't firing as it should. So as I mentioned before, retail and residential, they're really the weak links in the economy at the moment. But I think the residential sector, we can start to look up a little bit more positively. Now the reason for that is threefold. First of all, the Morrison government was re-elected, and essentially what that has done is put paid to any changes in negative gearing legislation that the Labor Party was proposing. The second one is we've had 2 interest rate cuts, and there's a potential for 2 further interest rate cuts. But the third factor, and this is probably the most important one, APRA has really loosened its criteria in terms of its lending criteria that banks need to employ in the residential sector. So what that has done, it's given households the capacity to borrow more. And what that's doing is we're seeing stabilisation in house prices and also auction clearance rates are improving. Now what this chart here indicates, it's a residential momentum indicator that we've built. There's basically 5 factors going into that. We're looking at prices, We're looking at transfers, dwelling approvals, unit approvals, and also construction starts. Now, the main takeout that we can see for the Sydney market, although it's still declining, that rate of decline has actually levelled out, and we're anticipating that it's going to start to improve in the back half of the year. First, it will be in terms of pricing, and then we'll see the construction pipeline in terms of approvals start to pick up again later in the year. More recently, over recent time, there has been a high level of construction in Sydney and Melbourne in particular. Now, in Sydney, that's been focused around those middle ring suburbs, Sydney, Parramatta, Ryde and Bayside, and also the CBD has seen a high volumes of unit supply. Now, this is in fact a response to the lack of supply that we had in the post-GFC period. For about 6 years, we saw supply at about half the level of the preceding almost 2 decades. So what that meant is that there was a shortage of supply, and that's why prices accelerated at such a high rate. But as we can see now, the supply pipeline has been turned back up. We've been delivering stock, and that's going to continue, even though it's starting to taper away already. It's going to continue until about the midpoint in 2020, although tapering. Given the recent level of approvals data, which is probably about 30 to 35% down from its peak, we're going to need to see that recover. Otherwise, we're going to get to a state post-2020 where there becomes a bit of a supply-demand imbalance. Supply over the next few years is largely focused on Parramatta. We've seen a lot of supply, and we're going to continue to see supply. So if if you're more cautious, then you'd be a little bit worried that there is going to be an oversupply scenario in Parramatta. Along with that supply, residential supply, we've also got a lot of office supply coming on in Parramatta over the near to medium term outlook period. So that market is quite active, and there's a lot of cranes and activity. Now, as I mentioned to you before, the supply in residential supply is tapering away, and that's going to continue to at least the midpoint of 2020 based on the approvals and starts data that we've seen. However, if we don't start to see supply again start to pick up in 2020, then we're going to get to this situation again where the supply-demand imbalance is skewed towards a lack of supply, and we'll start to see solid price growth again in 2021. So what I'd be looking for over the next 6 months is stabilisation in the level of approvals, building approvals, and then actually some growth towards Q4 and into Q1 next year. So I'll switch gears now and look at the office sector. What I like to do is look at momentum indicators. First of all, I'll look at white-collar employment, and then another one that we look at is company profits, which is really a good leading indicator of what companies are going to do in terms of expansion plans. Now, this first one, essentially what we've got is white-collar employment up to the most recent release, which was May, and we've taken the quarterly value, we've annualised it, we've taken the biannual value, annualised it, and then the annual value. So what it effectively means, if it's pointing up, white-collar employment is gaining momentum. If it's pointing down, white-collar employment is losing momentum. The one that stands out is Victoria. As well as having very, very high rates of white-collar employment growth, it's also accelerating still. Now, part of the reason there is that the Victorian population is growing at about 2.3% per year, and that's well above the Australian average of 1.5%. If we look at Sydney, there's actually been a bit of a deceleration in white-collar employment growth, and this is actually evident in the take-up of office space. Over the past 12 months, net absorption across the 6 major markets has totaled just 15,000 square metres, which is very, very low. And if you take co-working out of that equation, it's basically zero. So demand has definitely slackened off, and this is something we'll expect to persist going through the rest of 2019, starting to recover at some stage in 2020. Now, the other barometer I mentioned is company profits, and again, this is a good indicator because profitable companies are going to continue to expand. The main ones here are professional service and financial and insurance. They're the key occupiers in the Sydney market, and profitability within those 2 sectors has been declining. In the finance and banking and insurance sector, you've also got the double whammy of that's been effectively been dragged across the coals in the Banking Royal Commission over the past 18 months. So demand in that sector has really started to taper away. So what I'd like to do now is turn to Tristan. He'll give you some of the more micro view in terms of the office markets.
So the pendulum in the Sydney CBD has really shifted from what was a very landlord favourable market in what was a very tenant favourable market into what is now a very landlord favourable market. And we look at what the factors that have led to that are, we believe it's really fourfold. The first was what we call the Barangaroo effect. So when Barangaroo was announced, there was essentially 300,000 square metres of office supply that was coming online all at about the same time. So all of the major developers in the CBD put on the brakes on any new developments. And there's essentially a 6-year lag until the next, that new supply comes online. So the first new building will be 60 Martin Place, which is due for completion later this year. The second factor has been the performance of the residential markets. So residential across Australia has performed very well, but particularly in Sydney. So we've seen a lot of older B-grade buildings being converted from offices into apartments. The third factor has been the new metro lines. So the government compulsorily acquired about 3% of the CBD to demolish buildings and build new subway stations. Those buildings will come back, but again, it's about a 6-year lag between when they were taken out of the market and when they come back. And the fourth factor has been the rise of coworking, which we'll touch on a little bit later, and also tech firms. Both co-workers and tech firms have been growing exponentially in Sydney. The likes of Amazon, Google, Facebook, Salesforce, they're all taking large tranches of space. So these four factors have converged at roughly the same time. And then what we've seen is supply and demand get out of equilibrium. So on this graph, I generally look at the dark green line as demand, the light green line as supply, and then the pink line as vacancy. So you see in 2015 was the last piece of Barangaroo was delivered. And then ever since then, there's been very little supply. And in some years, so 2017 and 18, negative supply in the Sydney CBD. So those factors have forced the vacancy rate down. So we're now at almost a record at 3.9%, which is pretty much in uncharted territory. It's similar to where we were pre-GFC. When we're looking to the future, or to give a bit of a summary of New South Wales now, the GDP growth is at 1.7%. Our population is about just over 8 million. The size of the market is about 5 million square metres. Average rents are about $1,200 a metre and incentives up around 18%. When we forecast out to 2025, which is when we think the market will be back in a more balanced position, GDP growth will be up around 2.7%. The population would have grown to just over 9 million people. The market size grown to 5.6 million, rents jumped by about $200 a metre and incentives up by about 10%. In terms of what's next in the growth of Sydney, Sydney is constrained by water on three sides. So developing within the CBD proper is very, very challenging. It requires amalgamation of sites, which is difficult. So what we're anticipating is that there'll be a migration south. So you may have seen some press recently over the Central to Everleigh corridor that the New South Wales government is working on and hoping to create a tech precinct around Central Railway Station. This is a illustrative image of what could occur between Central Station and North Everleigh. But this will be the next big development tranche in Sydney. Similarly, there's been a lot of investment into infrastructure across New South Wales, but particularly in Sydney. The blue lines here show the metro line or metro network, which is currently under construction, and the hatched lines show what the government has just committed to. And so the really key piece is that from next year, the government will start constructing the second metro line, which will connect Parramatta with Martin Place, and commuters will be able to get between the two within 19 minutes. So we believe that once that infrastructure is in place, it will become much more viable for large occupiers to have a small head office in the CBD and a hub or a back office in the likes of Parramatta. There's also been some press this week about Barangaroo Central. There's been a big question mark over what's going to happen with Barangaroo Central and a dispute over the sightlines. That was resolved on Monday, so there's going to be a lot more clarity on the final tranche of the Barangaroo development, and we anticipate that that will be completed around 2025. Bradley mentioned coworking, and I'm sure everyone here has heard of WeWork and the others. This is not, or we don't believe this to be a fad. We think co-working is here to stay. When we look at other major markets around the world, the co-workers are very well established. WeWork, for instance, is the largest occupier of commercial office space in New York. So that's a market that's traditionally been dominated by the likes of Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and other financial services firms. So as at today, WeWork leases more space than any of them. This image here is intended to show that, firstly, how established the co-working phenomenon is across Asia, but also that in Australia we have a lot of players. Across Asia, it's really 4 or 5 players in each region. So we think there's going to be quite a lot of M&A activity and consolidation of the major co-working players in Sydney. Interestingly, that about 60% of demand or take-up in the first half of 2019 was from co-workers, and that was largely dominated by co-workers taking space in both Sydney and Melbourne. That's a very large tranche of space that co-workers are committing to ahead of traditional users of space. So when we look at what is the effect of co-working on the Sydney office market, well, our analysis shows that about 16% of all co-workers are currently vacant. So that equates to just over 25,000 square metres of space, which represents about 0.5% of the CBD. So if the vacancy rate, as recorded by the Property Council, is at 3.9%, if we add in that extra 0.5% of hidden vacancy within the co-workers, it's actually at about 4.5%. So, as a tenant advisor, that's good news. The higher the vacancy, the better. But it is just showing that the co-workers are having a fairly material impact on the state of the office market. Back to you, Bradley.
Thanks. Looking at the industrial sector now, I always like to start with a very positive slide. We're actually in a recession again in the industrial sector. I think, though, the conditions in the economy and how it's translating into property markets, there's a little bit of a difference there. And Michael can probably elaborate as to where demand is coming from a property perspective. But just looking at the higher level macroeconomic data, as I mentioned before, it's, the industrial economy is in a recession, and it's actually quite a deep recession. And it's driven by the slowdown in residential construction. Now, this chart also illustrates that there was recessionary periods in 2015, 2016. That was when the mining construction boom was coming off its highs. If you compare the depth of those downturns to what we're seeing right at the moment, it just gives you an indication about how important the residential construction industry is to the Australian economy and how large it is. So unfortunately, that's going to continue to be in, below the line for this year and probably well into next year. It's marginally being offset by wholesale, transport and warehousing, and we expect that to continue going forward as we start to see higher penetration from online retail. Like other commercial sectors, the industrial sector, we are seeing asset prices getting very, what we'd call probably toppy at the moment. We've seen prices grow almost 100% since 2012. And what typically happens there is obviously investors are being priced out of the market because we're seeing yields in Sydney in particular. Super prime yields have come down to 4.75%, and that's basically on par with what you'll get with a CBD office building, and that's a prime CBD office building. So if you're a developer, if you're an investor in the industrial space and you can no longer get those high returns, the best way to do it is to go and develop your own real estate. So what that has done is seen an increased demand, particularly in land out in Western Sydney. So what we've seen here, and this chart illustrates it, on the right-hand side, the pink bar it indicates land values, and over the past 3 years, industrial land values in Western Sydney have grown by about 110%. And the reason for this is because asset pricing has been getting high and people are going out there to develop their own stock. Put that into comparison, the rental growth achieved, and those are the green bars on the right-hand side, it's only been 10% over the past 3 years. So if we keep going with this trend, there's actually going to be a mismatch between land values and obviously the rents that you can achieve to get these developments off the ground. So that's something to look forward to. In the inner city location, the story has been quite different. We've seen a lot of rental growth continue. Over the past 3 years, rents have grown by about 20%. By comparison, now the reason for that strong rental growth is that there is a limited amount of supply in the inner locations, and you've got tenants still demanding that and obviously pushing rents up. By comparison, and comparing it to the Western Sydney, land values have not increased as much over the past few years. And the reason there is because of conditions in the residential sector. Now, inner city industrial locations, they have the added benefit that you can actually potentially convert some of that land into residential land use. So ultimately what happens when residential becomes less desirable and you start to see house prices going backwards, as we're seeing now, you also see the value of inner city industrial land going, growth starting to taper off, as we've seen recently, whereas growth is continuing in the Western Sydney area. So I'd like to hand over to Michael.
Thanks very much, Gavin, Adam and Melissa for having us here tonight. Echoing a lot of what Brad said, I'm affectionately known as what's called a Shetty, but basically in the last 3 to 5 years, and particularly in the last 2 years, there has been a great deal of change in industrial. Basically, land rates, as Brad has alluded to, have gone up dramatically. Rents have gone up, not so dramatically. Yields have tightened. But what is positive is that despite some of the market conditionings tapering, the land availability in Sydney is still quite tight. And so we're seeing justifications for some real changes in the market. Some of the things that we're seeing is automation, we're seeing robotics, there's the talk of drones, and something that you'd need to be an industrial to get excited about, but things like multi-level warehousing, which is something that's been done globally. It's commonplace in Southeast Asia and parts of America and Europe, and basically they appear to be like office blocks or big car parking areas but with very high roofs. And we're on the brink now in Sydney where I guess we're not like Melbourne. We don't have a lot of flat land to the west and to the north, and so we are expecting to see more change. And then from a super prime yields point of view, I must admit we've been thinking that yields can't get any tighter, but with the amount of offshore interest that we continue to have and with the success of industrial in the last few years, the market is very tight. In terms of rents, really what we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years is occupiers have become more sophisticated. They've, the typical warehouses that you might have seen down in South Sydney where they're very low clearance, tough access, that congestion has only got worse as residential has encroached. And so groups started to move further west looking for newer, more modern, higher facilities and have been prepared to pay higher rents for that. And then more recently, we've seen supply chain analytics becoming a really important part of what we do. Our supply chain director, Christine, who couldn't make it here this evening, it really is a science, really assessing where an occupier should locate in terms of industrial. It's, as Christine puts it, it's a good deal and a bad location is a bad deal. And basically, users have now assessed that rather than rental costs form only 5% of a total occupier's cost, whereas transport's more like 50%. And so really critical that you've got the right facility in the right location, and when you've found that right location, that's when they start to look in really investing in those buildings. Bradley did a superb job of covering why we've seen some of the growth that we have seen in land values, and it's really that's true that the land rate has sort of outperformed rents, and rents have had some catching up to do, and we've seen that really in those inner west South Sydney areas where consumer demand for products through e-commerce has really driven the rents in those areas. But in outer west, where land rates have climbed quickly from $400 to $700 a square metre, the rent has been a little bit more incremental. But again, in both locations, but whether it be inner or outer, land supply in Sydney remains tight. As you'll see there, in 2018-19, it's tapering over the next few years, and the reason why that is that there is a shortage of serviced land in Western Sydney. Sort of what is a bit unusual is that we will start to see the Central West, that sort of moderately green colour. Developers like Dexus, Logos, Charter Hall, Goodman have identified that the rental growth is really in those core areas where consumers are demanding sort of same-day delivery. Demand for industrial assets still remains incredibly strong, whether it be land, contaminated land, super prime assets, particularly I think in the sub 5,000 square metre range, because a lot of developers have had the benefit that building big boxes, as they're referred to, is a lot cheaper than building smaller units, and the demand has been there. So there's really, there is real demand sub 5,000 square metres, but strong buyer sentiment across the board. Now again, I've touched on some of these and we'll move through them relatively quickly because Bradley has as well a lack of land supply, e-commerce, which is really a topic in itself, and the infrastructure piece, which has somewhat like the residential market bolstered the industrial market. Land supply, we're talking big areas of land here. We've got currently now approximately 600 hectares of developable land, which is compared to about 900 back in 2010. And that means that, and that's spread across a range of sites, but it means that if a larger user like an Amazon, for example, comes to Sydney and wants to find a suitable site and needs to set up within a 12-month period, the land supply is tight. We're expecting that will remain like that for the next 1 to 2 years, and then there will be areas down towards where Badgerys Creek in far western and southwest Sydney that will be released. Then the rise of e-commerce, certainly the penetration of e-commerce in Australia, 73% of households in Australia have acquired online. You've got the 10% of retail spend that's due to grow at a rate of 25% per annum. And when we look at our retailers and most groups, that's where they're seeing their growth. And that is, that's where we're seeing some of these exciting new trends. You know, we're working with groups at the moment now that aren't doing it right now, but they're really wanting to make sure that there's solar panels, that these are groups that are facilitating the delivery, that they feel that there will be driverless cars and that they'll need the power. In that regard, they're needing super flat floors for automation and robotics, and super flat roofs for the likelihood of drones. And we was fortunate to work with Google in Canberra for the first testing of their drones, and it seems quite incredible, but you know, when I spoke to our head of research from Chicago and was chatting to him about it, he said, look, it's no more dramatic than when cars first came on the scene. So a lot of exciting things to come. And then finally, on the infrastructure boom, it has a real knock-on effect in industrial that wherever a lot more convenient to put it through industrial land, and so the knock-on effect of having to move those tenants and users takes up, a lot of space in what is only, we're across the board about 2% vacancy. And then just on the walk up here, just with projects like the light rail, I'm, aware of where the pavers came from, where the signage came from. They all came from warehouses out west, and so there is that certain effect as well. So there is a tapering in the industrial market, but Sydney is a tight market, and so we're keen for more exciting times. So before I pass it across to our gracious hosts, in summary from Brad, 2019 going to remain a bit of a tough year, but things on the improve in 2020. Office, stable demand and limited supply. And I think industrial and logistics, that's a fair summary as well. I think that the demand is not quite as strong as perhaps it is, but it's a very tight market. Thank you.
Well, it's all doom and gloom. First of all, thank you, Bradley, Tristan and Mike, for a very riveting set of facts, and it puts us all in a position to know that where we are looking in the future is not going to be as a stable environment as it has been for the last little while. Now, with that, as lawyers, with the limited amount of stock and supply in the market, what we find is that there is an incentive for both tenants and landlords to secure deals and to secure them quickly. As Tristan said, there's very little supply in the Sydney market, and if you're not in a WeWork environment, then the demand for that, you're going to be competing with a number of other businesses. What we tend to see in our industry is that because of that, you have a competing interest between landlord and tenant. People want to get their leases done quickly, and they want to get them done effectively so that they don't risk being gazumped on a site. Now, generally what that means is we get an email come through, and it normally heads over to Melissa and her team, and the tenant goes something like this. Dear Melissa, please find attached the heads of agreement that we've come to agree with the landlord. These are the essential terms. Can you please give us a rundown on the potential risks of our lease? Now, as lawyers, our ears prick up and we say, oh my God, how many risks could there be? And the client says, well, look, just give us the top 10. And we always know that number 11 is going to come back to bite them in the butt. So with the shorter timeframes that we're getting, we are going to see an increased risk for both tenants and landlords who seek to try and minimise that due diligence phase or the negotiation phase through their lease. So when you're looking at a site like this, you'll generally find that in most leases or agreements, landlords and tenants will generally have their own wants and needs. And for the most part, they generally work separate, but there is the grey area. And the grey area is generally where you need skills and experience in negotiating these things, because they're generally the areas where there's going to be dispute. Now, Melissa's going to go into a little bit of detail tonight about a few of the provisions that sit around a few separate areas, and just some takeaway tips for all of you when you're looking at leases to have a think about when you're trying to negotiate your heads of agreement, because often the heads of agreement really sets the stage for the negotiating position. It's an anchor point for both parties, and it's very hard to move that anchor point once it's set.
That's true. Often the heads of agreement, once it's signed, clients think that's it. But there are other provisions in a lease which they may be unaware and which can pose risk and cost money. And if some of those provisions were nutted out and included in the heads of agreement, it would make the process of signing the lease that much smoother. And we don't mind, we enjoy actually being involved in the heads of agreement stage so that we can discuss those risks before the lease is prepared and everything is recorded in print. But as Adam says, the need to move quickly, especially in this market, is great. And often lawyers are seen as slowing down the process. but leases are onerous documents. They place significant risk on tenants and they deserve to be read, and every line needs to be read. There's no such thing as a high-level review of a lease. The devil is in the detail. When Adam and I sat down to nut out what we thought we'd talk about tonight, we were bouncing clauses of a lease back and forth with each other. That's what we do. And these 5 came up as ones that you can get bogged down in negotiation, and that often we run around into disputes because they've blown up and we need help. Options, repairs, personal or director guarantees, releases and indemnities, and the make good clause.
So, first thing that I'm going to chat about is options. Now, there's really 4 main criteria with options. The first is how we exercise them. It's got to be by way of written notice. Now, that written notice needs to say certain things. It can't be an email. It's the one thing that we always say, follow the terms of your lease. How many of us today here have a smartphone in their pocket and would most likely pull that out and send a quick email for business purposes without thinking twice? Probably most of us. I know I do. We really need to be careful with the exercise of leases, with options, because the courts do look at the form of the written notice. And not only the form of the written notice, but the wording of the written notice. There was recently a case that was heard down in Victoria where a tenant had sought to exercise its option and used the words, "It is our intention to exercise our option for the period of 6 years commencing on X." And at the lease commencement date, the landlord hadn't provided them with a new lease. And so they went off to VCAT and said to VCAT, "Look, we've validly exercised our option." And VCAT said, "Well, no, you didn't. What you did was evidenced an intention to exercise your option, and the fundamentals of contract law came through. And essentially that person lost out on their tenancy and subsequently entered into a new lease at much higher terms." So the takeaway is make sure that your written notice follows the form of the lease. The next one is that it's served in time. Now, there is some dispute about whether an option is essentially a conditional irrevocable offer to grant a new lease. And if that is the case, then you can't extend time because it would just be a counter-offer. There's countervailing authorities on the other side that say that it's just a conditional contract. The easiest way to get around all of this is just follow the timing in the lease. It will generally tell you within 6 months from the date of termination and before 3 months, you need to exercise your option. So one thing that we always say is always look at the timings, diarise them early, speak to people like Tristan early if you're not going to take up your lease, but have those safety nets in place so that you don't miss those dates, because those dates are critical. I mentioned quickly that it's got to be served in accordance with the terms of the lease. Again, generally the lease will tell you who it's to be served on. Don't serve it on the agent, although you may have been liaising with them for the last 5 years, because that may not be the valid address for service. Don't serve it on the individual's primary place of business if that's not what the lease says. And the last one is that you're not in breach of the lease. Now, this is an interesting one because different forms of breach will affect your ability to call on an option. And I might pass it over to Melissa to take you through a standard provision in relation to an option and some of the risks in it, and then I'll touch on breach a little bit later.
So this is a typical clause that you'll see in a commercial lease. And at first blush, it's okay. Yep, it covers all the bases. I think if I was looking at that, one of the things I would hone in on is that the base rent for the new lease is to be the current market rent. And that's fair enough. But that clause will hook you back into the rent review clauses under the lease. And the timing of those clauses won't necessarily fit well with the timing of a tenant having to exercise the option. So I would try and get the lease negotiated so that before a tenant is required to exercise the option, the market rent is first reviewed. This typically happens in retail leases where it's required by legislation. And I try to also make that more common in commercial leases. Whether I'm successful often depends on, the power and the might of the tenant. And if I can't get that, I will try and build in that the tenant can call on the landlord to give its indication of the market rent. because I've recently had a client who exercised their option to renew. The rent review clauses then said that the landlord will give its assessment of the current market rent 3 months before and 3 months after the rent review date, in this case the lease commencement date. And our client, needing to make plans for its business, was asking the landlord, what's the rent? What do you think the assessment of the rent is? And the landlord just wouldn't respond. And we didn't have a lot in the lease that we could prod the landlord along with. And of course, if they couldn't agree on the rent, it then had to go to valuation. So we could have been in the situation where the client didn't know the commencing rent until 6 months into the lease. And that was not sitting well with them at all. The other, and maybe you're going to speak about this, Adam, but this, you can't exercise your option if you're in breach of the lease. That's how it reads. But there is legislation that sits behind that that says a landlord can't deny you your option lease because of breach unless it has first served you notice that you're in breach, notified you of that breach before you've exercised your option. So that's not really a get out of jail free card for landlords, and landlords should monitor their tenants and serve notices of breach along the way.
And just following that on a little bit from what Melissa said, generally when tenants are in breach and landlords seek to try and avoid granting an option, they will go into forfeiture and they'll say, well, no, you forfeited your right and we're going to come in and seize possession of the property. Now, what is forfeiture? Forfeiture is when a landlord ends the lease due to a tenant breaching, and it's generally in relation to either rent or a continuous non-monetary breach. Now, there's 3 situations where the court will actually look at this and say, well, no, we need to come to the aid of the tenant because these breaches aren't sufficient enough to give rise to them losing their contractual bargain. Now, the court can do it by way of 2 means. One is by specific performance, enforcing the contract and ordering the landlord to specifically perform the obligations under the lease. The second way, which is a little bit more fruitful for most tenants, is utilising the relief against forfeiture provisions under the Conveyancing Act and in equity. Now, relief against forfeiture basically is an order sought by the court whereby the tenant can say, we have forfeited the lease, or at least there's been a demand that we forfeited the lease, and we haven't been paying our money, and really all this is the landlord's attempt to try and get us to repay the money, but we're happy to repay it and there's a sufficient bond there to cover the lease. Generally in those circumstances the court will grant relief and the tenant will be given the property back. The other situation where equity might relieve is if there's fraud or mistake, and this generally happens whereby notice is attempted to be provided, there's essentially some communication between landlord and tenant to an effect that yes, the option's been exercised, and then there's a counter argument later on saying, well, hold on a second, you use that little word intention there rather than contract, so I'm not going to grant you your lease. And so the court will come to the aid of tenants if it has to in those types of situations.
I think there are touch points through the life of the lease where it is worthwhile going back to your solicitor to get some legal advice, and exercise of options is one of those touch points. Repair. A typical repair provision in a lease: the lessee must maintain and keep the premises in good and tenantable repair. That's great. What I would first say is it's all about the tenant, and you're unlikely to see in a typical commercial lease an obligation on the landlord to keep the building, the common areas and the rest of the land in good and tenantable repair, and waterproof and watertight. We get many complaints from tenants because there are drips and leaks in their premises that landlords won't fix. So generally, I try to put a clause in, putting an obligation on the landlord to keep the premises, the building in good repair, and that's reasonable and usually agreed to. And depending on the type of premises and the nature of the tenant, sometimes we also put in quite specific provisions as to landlord maintaining roadways, for example, in industrial properties where there's heavy vehicles being used. But with this clause, I think the missing components is what is the standard of repair? to what standard must the tenant keep the premises in repair? And that's where you want to see words to the effect of having regard to the commencement of the premise, to the condition of the premises at the commencement of the lease, and get a condition report or at least photographic evidence so that you have evidence of what that condition is. The other glaring omission is structural and capital repairs. Unless the need for those repairs are caused by the tenant or unless they arise because of their particular use of the premises, a tenant shouldn't be lumbered with structural or capital repairs. Not using this well, sorry, going the wrong way. So just tips to remember about repair, and this is something that is good to agree in a heads of agreement, if you can, before the 60, 70 page document is produced. Always have regard to the condition of the premises at the commencement. Exclude structural and capital repairs from the tenant's obligation. Also exclude acts of God, floods, tempests, storms, and limit the obligation for damage caused by the landlord or the landlord's agents.
The next big one is directors and personal guarantees. Can I get a show of hands who signs directors or personal guarantees in this room? No one? Good. Melissa will be happy, because the one thing we say to most of our clients is don't sign directors or personal guarantees. This is a standard director and personal guarantee provision. And what you will see is that you're essentially on the hook for almost everything. You unconditionally and irrevocably agree that you're going to be liable to the lessor for anything. Now, you can give away your first child, and some of us might be happy about that, but not many are going to be happy when they're coming after our houses for something which we're not liable for. So we really need to be careful from a litigation point of view, and something that Gavin and I do a lot of is trying to work out and structure ourselves so that we're not giving personal guarantees. And the way that you might do that in a heads of agreement is agree to increase the amount of the bond that you're going to give rather than giving a personal guarantee. Potentially offer 6 months up rather than an unconditional and unlimited guarantee. So I'll just continue on. The principal obligations generally are wide. They're generally not limited by time, and that's a big problem. So what you may find with guarantees is that you've assigned your lease, but are you still liable under the guarantee? And that's really a big problem that a lot of people don't think about when they assign, because they're more than happy to try and get out of their lease and continue moving it forward. So tips to remember with respect to guarantees: negotiate a limited guarantee. If they're going to have to give a guarantee, try and specify an amount. Try and specify it to 6 months of your lease, or alternatively 12 months. It may be for the entirety, but at least you'll have certainty as to where you're going. Negotiate a provision in there that your guarantee ceases upon assignment. What you don't want to be is liable for the incoming tenant's obligations under the lease, because you have no control of the premises by that stage. And lastly, and this is more from a litigious point of view, but undertake searches on whoever is giving a guarantee if you are getting one, because the one thing that you don't want to do is seek to rely on your guarantee provisions and find out later, after running a contentious litigation matter, that the person's a man of straw, because realistically what we're going to end up with is a very hollow judgment.
Release and indemnity clauses are included in every lease and are always trailed over by solicitors. Some of the things I would look for is that the landlord's own negligence, willful acts are excluded, because a tenant shouldn't have to indemnify or release the landlord for the landlord's negligence. More modern leases will exclude that now, but old ones it won't be, so you always have to look out for that. And also in the, I'm giving it all away. Also in the indemnity, here the lessee is indemnifying the lessor against any damage contributed to by the lessee or its agents. That's not uncommon to see, and what it doesn't do is tie the indemnity to the premises and what the lessee does in the premises. So I always look to make sure the release and indemnity is focused on the premises.
So a couple of important considerations for releases and indemnities. Always try and limit them to direct loss. Try and get away from the reasonably foreseeable losses. It's generally going to end up on my desk or Gavin's desk, and we're going to be having a fight about what was reasonably foreseeable. Avoid phrases such as arising from or in connection with. They're ambiguous. People don't know what they mean, and it opens up Pandora's box with respect to, well, I think that might have been in connection with, and where does the chain of causation stop? So if we can try and eliminate that from our drafting, then everyone's going to be a lot better off. Try and limit the coverage to the leaseholder, the tenant. Try not to indemnify their agents, as Melissa said, or their directors, employees, third parties, because that's just going to lead to unnecessary liability. Require everybody to mitigate. Now, I was chatting to Melissa about this today, and she said, oh, but Adam, you've got a common law obligation to mitigate. And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. But having a contractual obligation there gives the court another way to find in your favour should you have to go and have a dispute with respect to the value of your mitigation. And lastly, limit the indemnity to reasonable expenses and not indemnity. Now, most standard lease costs that you get, or leases, that you get from a landlord will say that you're indemnified on an indemnity basis, including solicitor client basis for legal fees. If you could try and avoid those, I think you'll be in a much better position.
I think the other thing about indemnities and releases too is it's something you can insure against. And so I always advise my clients to show their insurer the release and indemnity clauses as well as the insurance clauses to make sure their insurance cover covers them for the risk they're assuming under those clauses. Because contractual indemnities will be wider than in common law, and you need to make sure you've got the insurance to cover that. Make good. When you're entering into a lease, the last thing you want to think about, I guess, is exiting. But the make good, I assure you, is one of those touch points where we always get a call, and they're the clauses where I typically have to go and see Adam and Gavin because a dispute is brewing. Think about make good as you enter in. If you're going into commercial premises and you're using the existing tenant's fit out, is it your obligation to remove that fit out at the end? You know you've got to clean up, maybe repaint and redecorate, but what else do you need to do? And again, this is another example where it might be good to agree with the landlord at the beginning and itemise what the obligations are, because they can get really expensive. Adam and I just had a matter where our client leased, among other things, a clean room, where it did do some damage to that clean room, and at the end, to make good, it was up front, yes, they wanted to make good the damage, and the landlord wouldn't respond, and so there was delay, which meant that the rent was still ticking, and then when the landlord did respond, there was a dispute as to what damage did our client cause and what damage was pre-existing. A condition report of photographic evidence at the time would have gone a long way to help to solve that dispute, but that wasn't in existence. The other thing was that the landlord, the overarching thing was that the make good had to happen to the landlord's reasonable satisfaction. And the landlord was anything but reasonable here, and so we were having an argument as to what was a reasonable repair and what wasn't. And we also had to use the landlord's trades. And again, we then had a dispute as to whether we could use our own or not. The other gem with that lease, and this is why you do need to read every line of a lease, is that some of the obligations were in the make good provisions and others were in the provisions relating to termination of a lease. And our client had only read half and didn't realise there was the other. So make good is one of those provisions I do always focus at the beginning to try and let the tenant exit cleanly at the end.
So just following up on that, what Melissa has said is get yourself a condition report, try and tailor the clause so that you can agree upfront in principle as to what the works will be, and discuss the works that you're going to do with the landlord at or about the time that you're doing them. That's generally going to resolve most of the disputes, and whilst you might be paying a little bit more on the front end at that point of view, it's much better than paying more on the back end when you're still stuck with your rental liabilities and then a dispute as to where you're going to go with it. Lastly, don't get fixated on little things like the difference between best endeavours and reasonable endeavours. I like this as an example because it's one that Melissa and I always get when we get a drafting that comes back and says, oh, no, we're not going to give best endeavours, we'll just do our reasonable endeavours. They mean the same thing. The courts have said they mean the same thing. So try not to get fixated on those little things, because all that leads to do is it slows down the negotiation for your clients, and it often will mean that you'll take other disputes on which aren't really necessary because people have got their back out of joint in relation to this.
I think that's right. I mean, as I said, a lease is an onerous document. It does deserve the time to be read. A tenant should have the opportunity to negotiate it, but don't nitpick over it. Negotiate on the main clauses, because I see an important part of my job is to protect my client, but also to ensure that the landlord-tenant relationship going forward is a good one. When the lawyers and the leasing agents fall away, you want to have a good relationship with your landlord, because the best lease is the one that you can throw in the bottom drawer and not have to pore over during the term.
And that brings us to an end from the lawyerly side of leasing. Unless there's any questions? No? Perfect. Well, what I'd like to do is thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it. It's been a great evening hearing from the gents at CBRE. I'd also personally like to thank each and every one of you. I think your presentation was fantastic and it gives us all a lot to think about. And I might just offer a token of thanks, and if we can all express our congratulations in the usual way with a round of applause for the gents at CBRE.